Welcome back to Church in the World. This is the second part of our discussion of our shared calling in education. And we're talking today about the question, will all children and youth have access to high quality education? This is the third section of the ELCA's 2007 Social Statement on Education. So we'll be reading through this together. This part of the statement is primarily about how we as Christians, as private citizens, and as church are going to relate to, support, critique, evaluate public educational systems for children and youth. So this is aimed primarily at public schooling systems, although it also, in the section, will address public and private universities and things like that, non-ELCA institutions especially. But this is mostly aimed at what most people think of when they think of public schools, right? That this is what that venue. So first of all, we have to understand what schools, aside from congregational establishments or ELCA church schools, what schools broadly speaking are for. Schools should prepare students academically, right? If the student's not gaining academic preparation for academic rigor and ways to engage academia, then the school has failed, right? That's one of its primary purposes. Schools should also encourage students' personal flourishing, developing their knowledge and wisdom and instilling a delight in learning. That is to say, schools should be good. They should help develop children and youth into who they're going to be. They should prepare students for productive work and financial responsibility. In other words, there's a practical element to it, preparing for one's vocation and gearing students up for how to live life in an effective way that is not going to hamper them and not create expectations that are unrealistic and give them skills that they're going to need. It's also, though, important to note that, as we said in the previous point, schools are supposed to instill a joy in learning. No child should leave high school going, why would I ever want to learn anything again? Why would I ever want to read a book, right? No, if that's what our schools are producing, something has gone deeply wrong with them. And schools should equip children and youth to live and serve in a complex, diverse, and interdependent global society, and to be responsible and civil citizens. High quality education schools, right? Schools that provide a high quality education excel in accomplishing these purposes. This is really important because this gives us the criteria to measure what we mean by high quality education. It's not just education that gets you into a good college, though that's probably a good result to look for. It's not really the criterion we're looking at, right? Nor is it we have the best facilities, nor is it we have the best teachers or any of that stuff. All of those are things that will probably correlate to doing these things well, but that's not the purpose. That's not the evaluative purpose, right? And in fact, the fact that such things do tend to correlate tells us something about what we're going to have to do to ensure high quality education is accessible for all students. And that's something we're going to get to in a moment. Now, here's the thing. Nearly 90% of students in our current society, now this is 2007, so who knows if that's accurate, but 90% or so are enrolled in public schools. And these government-run and tax-supported schools represent the most significant public commitment to provide formal education for all young people. American and Puerto Rican societies rightly place high expectations on public schools. In providing access to education for all, public schools are to generate a more equitable society, right? Yet resources to support these expectations compete with the demands of other public responsibilities such as health, human services, and public safety. Why they compete with those things is an interesting question that I don't think this statement asks. But I'm going to ask, why is that a competition? Why can't we have all those things to the level of expectation that we have already? We live in the most wealthy country in the world at the most prosperous and technologically advanced point in world history. Why can't we have excellent health care, excellent human services, excellent public safety, and excellent education. The case is not made. It's just assumed here passively that there's a scarcity of resources, that you can't have all these things at once. Um, or rather, what's acknowledged is that that's the current curvature of the discussion. So keep that in mind. Public schools historically have enjoyed widespread support, but in recent decades, public discourse about them often has been shaped by criticism and discontent. We reconfirm our commitment to the concept and work of public schools. We join with others in seeking change where they did not live up to expectations. Especially, we call for public attention and action on behalf of those children and youth who are not receiving a good education. So, first of all, we are committed to public schools. We view them with gratitude, right? We're grateful that we live in a society where we have them. We rejoice in the opportunity for education that public schools offer to all children, including children who suffer the effects of poverty and discrimination, and children with special learning needs. And we recognize how public schools in various situations bring together children and youth from many different backgrounds. We view these public schools with realism, hope, and wisdom. We recognize human limitations and the power of sin. We are prepared to be critical where our public schools fall short, and we seek to be conscious of our own limitations and how our self-interest may influence and distort our views. The education of young people is a shared responsibility among parents, schools, religious bodies, and community. And so this means that we have a right or authority to fulfill that responsibility. Parents have a primary but not exclusive responsibility, which involves them in education in home and school and in congregation. And it gives parents the right to select whether to send their children to public, religious, or private schools or to homeschool them. But we also believe that because children are God's gifts to society and the church, society through government has a responsibility and authority to provide for young people's education. This responsibility and right are derived from both parents' consent and the government's mandate to provide for the common good and the well-being of those in its jurisdiction. This responsibility gives government the right to levy taxes for education, to enact compulsory attendance laws, to set educational standards, and to operate public schools. The shared responsibility between parents and public schools and their teachers should be one of partnership. We expect schools to be communities of learning and teaching. All schools should strive, above all, to be communities in which people with distinct roles join together in mutual respect around the common concern for learning, teaching, and knowing. Okay? They ought to be places of thoughtful and civil instruction and dialogue. In addressing social needs to reduce poverty or improve health, for example, schools should do so principally as an educational community, as occasions for learning and teaching. When public schools perform other social functions, government should ensure they have adequate resources in addition to resources supporting their primary educational purpose. Extracurricular opportunities in sports, the arts, and forensics should develop healthy leadership and encourage strong academic performance. School organizations should facilitate schools' identity as communities of learning and teaching. Students should learn to think and read critically, write and speak clearly, understand math and science competently. They will become acquainted with a wide variety of humanistic, scientific, artistic, and practical subject matters. They will be introduced both to the broadly accepted content of different disciplines and to the processes and methods by which these disciplines arrive at their conclusions. They will come to think on their own, ask questions, and be creative in their learning. They will learn to care for their health and how to stay physically fit. To prepare students, schools require competent leadership from principals and boards, good teachers and counselors, research-based teaching methods and curricula, adequate facilities and resources, parental and community support and involvement, and eager students. When public schools are not accomplishing these purposes adequately, citizens have a responsibility to work to improve them. Public attention to social and economic influences on student readiness is also essential, so that students are not hungry, in ill health, or victims of violence or abuse. We expect communities of learning and teaching to be safe places. We recognize that school safety is an issue for all students, staff, and teachers. Unfortunately, incidents of bullying, intimidation, and other forms of violence are not unusual. We affirm that personal safety and security are essential for optimal teaching and learning. We are also committed to the education of students with disabilities and the provision of needed technical and adaptive technology, qualified teachers and staff, appropriate curricula and programs, and support services. Right? In all this, what we're saying is that schools have an vital role in forming what Lutherans think of as civil righteousness. Now, civil righteousness is a complicated idea. Um, in a way, what it really means is the idea of forming ourselves in such a way that we uphold what is best in society for the common good. That might be the simplest explanation, right? That's why we expect civil institutions to contribute to civil righteousness, not because they agree with our theology or morals, but because they know what does and doesn't make for a good society. And if they don't, they should be told, and the church, we think, knows. Um, No education is morally neutral. I'm going to say that again. No education is morally neutral. Public schools do communicate moral beliefs and values. Public schools ought to teach the principles and virtues of living together in a responsible freedom in a democratic society, which includes respect for diverse cultures and beliefs of their students. Moral education suited for public schools will draw on what the community holds in common and teach in a fair and impartial way on those issues on which the community is divided. Right. So the church expects public schools to teach about religion as a vital part of human life and culture. When they do not teach about religion, public schools leave students with a distorted picture of the world, right? Public schools, such as government institutions, should not sponsor religious exercises such as prayer or devotional reading of religious texts, nor advocate for or against any particular religion. They should, however, help their students understand the importance of religion for individuals, history, and contemporary life by teaching about the beliefs, practices, and history of different religions in fair and informative ways. This will require competent teachers and good curricula. This is actually really interesting because I didn't receive that in public school, and I went to a fairly affluent, fairly highly rated public school system. Um, I didn't get that education until I did my major in comparative religious studies in undergraduate education as a bachelor in college. So this is actually curriculum that, to my knowledge, almost nowhere in America exists. So, and this is again a statement that's 15 years old. So contemplate that, right? Why is this happening? The ELCA affirms the search for truth and meaning in its many different forms. In teaching the sciences, schools should acknowledge the distinctions between them and religion, right? While religion and faith provide subject matter and methods to speak of God's role in the origin and purpose of creation, we do not claim they provide a scientific account of how the natural world functions. While the natural and physical sciences have tested methods to describe and explain the natural world and we learn from them, we do not look to science to answer religious questions. Schools and teachers should respect the distant approaches to truth and knowledge in the natural and physical sciences and religion, explore the philosophical issues in their relationship, and recognize moral questions that may arise from them, and various proposed answers to these questions. Another thing that certainly wasn't covered in my public education. Interesting, right? I wonder, right? We should all wonder how these curricula get created that are not achieving all these things, even in the best funded and best staffed schools. The ELCA encourages congregations and pastors to develop strong connections with their public schools for the sake of the children in their communities. Congregations can join with public schools in affirming the importance of education and countering views that devalue or denigrate education. We can ask our public schools how they can assist students and provide space and volunteers for how we, the congregations, can provide space and volunteers for after-school activities such as tutoring. Pastors and roster leaders can make themselves available as a resource people in teaching about religion. And we in Lutheran social ministry organizations, etc., right? Like, so we partner with public schools is the point, right? We're not supposed to be totally separate from these efforts in our communities as congregants, as pastors, as congregations. Now, here we go. Equitable access to high quality education for all. So let's see here. Researchers differ on the quality of public school education. Some argue that given the nature of public support and the resources provided, public schools do well when compared to public education systems in other countries. Others argue public schools are not meeting the challenges of an increasingly complex and competitive global economy. All agree that public schools face the enormous task of offering high-quality education to prepare citizens and workers for today's knowledge-based global world. The ELCA's commitment to equitable access for all to education calls us to attend to the glaring iniquities in this country's schooling. The disturbing reality persists that too many young people do not have access to good public schools. This reality is most pervasive in poor communities, especially where poverty is intertwined with a history of racism and discrimination. More than half century after the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision, many schools remain racially separate and unequal, often in connection with residential segregation. Schools where a substantial majority of students live in poverty consistently represent schools with the fewest resources and some of the lowest performances. Federal, state, and district funding often shortchange schools that serve students who need the most support from their schools. For example, educational funding from the federal government to American Indian and Alaska Native communities, both on and off reservations. The connection between persistent poverty, along with discrimination and the lack of equitable access to high quality schools, means that many factors contribute to this society's failure to educate all young people. People who are poor face daily a vast assortment of interlocking hardships related to low paying jobs, inadequate housing in dangerous and unhealthy environments, poor health, physical disabilities, disrupted families, language barriers, unwise personal choices, as well as inadequate schools. One of this society's greatest challenges is to attend to all the factors that contribute to poverty. Good schools alone cannot break the cycle of generational poverty, yet they have an indispensable role in doing so. American and Puerto Rican societies have an obligation to do all they can to realize the dreams of children and youth who live in poverty, that education will improve their lives. We commit ourselves to work with others for public policies that boldly and consistently push toward ensuring that all students have equitable access to high quality schools. All right, how do we do that? Well, we have a responsibility and competence to determine what specific measures will most improve equitable access for all students to high quality schools in our communities, states, and nations. Citizens, political office holders, educators, and researchers representing a wide range of attitudes toward public schools recognize that these schools should and can do better in improving the performance of their students. When they are considering any proposed reform, we encourage all to evaluate it in terms of its appropriateness, its effectiveness, and its cost. We should ask of a proposal, does it improve the educational quality for all students? Is it effective in enhancing student learning? Does it assist educators in their work? Is it affordable and sustainable? Does it protect students from invidious discrimination? Is it supported by reliable research? Is there a means to evaluate the results of the program and decide if the program should be continued, modified, or ended? We call upon members of the ELCA to consider the following. First, countering negative effects of poverty and discrimination. This requires compensatory measures for children and young people who are encumbered by social disadvantages to increase their chances of equal opportunity for a good education, including providing resources and opportunities to overcome negative effects of poverty and injustice, broadening the tax base and funding strategies to achieve adequate funding for every school, expanding and funding good early childhood education for children in poverty and special education, creating incentives to attract high-quality teachers, administrators, and staff to schools where most students live in poverty, involving parents and caregivers in their children's education through parental classes and other means, and creating opportunities for education that cross ethnic, social, economic, and jurisdictional lines. We also call for equity in funding. While increased funds by themselves do not ensure better educational results, their strategic investment can make a difference. Moreover, equity in funding among schools districts is a matter of justice and is mandated in most, but not all, state constitutions. In states where per pupil funding is vastly unequal, usually where school redistricting relies on local property taxes for their revenue, citizens should work actively to reform the funding system. Reforms should be evaluated in terms of their effectiveness in improving student learning. A growing number of school districts and states seek to increase the range of school students can attend through policies that establish magnet schools, open enrollment, charter schools, tax credits, and vouchers. Research on this whole range of options continues. Many are encouraged by the experiences of their children with these options, particularly in urban neighborhoods. Increasing school options appeals to the idea of choosing among schools and the belief that competition among schools improves educational quality. Others argue that some of these options will increase racial segregation, weaken public schools, benefit principally the privileged sectors of society, and leave too many students in poor performance schools. The effects of each of these policies need to be evaluated in local context with a special focus on whether or not the option improves educational quality and offers greater opportunity for children and youth living in poverty. So this is something you have heard many times, and you're going to hear it again. The litmus test is not, does it make your child's life better, but does it make the lives and educational opportunities of the most vulnerable, most impoverished, most marginalized children better? That is to say, it is not based on you, your personal experience, or even on overall statistics, but is aimed at those who most need assistance. That is not always how legislation is written, right? Equitable access to excellent education cannot happen if we try to improve all schools simultaneously, because some schools are doing better than others, some students are doing better than others, some schools have been given more resources through a variety of legislative realities, right? So that's just the case. So we are going to have accountability to all public schools for education of their students. How to do so is a source of contention. The effect, some laws have some results and some have others. Policies to implement accountability should address the whole education agenda. They should include providing for appropriate periodic adjustment in outcome goals and evaluating academic progress with qualitative and quantitative measures. They should take into account the individual situation of students, especially those who are negatively affected by language disabilities or social disadvantages. They should provide, where indicated, adequate resources to implement remediation and improve the quality of education. They should offer, as a last resort, adequate alternatives for students attending schools that consistently do not meet performance standards. They should give careful and comprehensive assessment to measure the impact on student learning. Efforts to improve educational quality focus on every other aspect of public schools, including changing who controls them, restructuring administration or organization, creating smaller schools in urban areas or consolidating smaller schools in rural areas, reducing class size, extending school calendars or school hours, introducing merit pay, improving teacher and administrator education and development, improving teaching methods and classroom environments, and changing curricula. Parents also have a role to play. We urge parents to be aware of their options and to consider the special needs and gifts of their child, whether or not they desire a faith-based education for their child, how well each option that is available to them will achieve the purposes of education that we've already discussed, and how well the options prepare the student for life with and for service to others, and the affordability of their options. Remembering that education is a shared responsibility, we encourage parents to consult with others who may be of assistance in making these decisions. What have we said? We have said that education is a complicated thing to offer in a society with a lot of things to be aware of, but something that we need to primarily focus on is the inequity within the educational system. That must be remediated, and it is our job as church to continue advocating for and working for that remediation. That is to say, resources, if they need to be redistributed, need to be redistributed, right? If policies need to be rewritten, they need to be rewritten. But we cannot have public schools in Ridgewood, New Jersey, being far and away some of the best public schools in America, and public schools in Asbury Park being terrible. That is not acceptable. They're in the same state, that they need to both be providing high quality education. That's what they need to do. And if they can't do that, we need to look at why. And if the reason is because in Asbury Park there's a lack of funding, or in Asbury Park there's a lack of accountability, or in Ridgewood perhaps there's an excess of funding, right? We need to talk about whatever it is that's going on that creates this inequity. And probably it's a mixture of all those things and more, right? Underlying all of this, of course, has been stuff that we've talked about before, because children with sick parents tend to do worse in school. Children who are poor tend to do worse in school. Children who are racial minorities tend to do worse in school. Children who have a lack of health care tend to do worse in school. Children who are unable to receive regular meals tend to do worse in school. All of it tied together. If we want excellent education and more equitable education, we have to work more generally towards a more equitable and just society overall. And that's why all of this is intertwined, and why you should care about your local school board conferences and meetings. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that you have learned something from it, or at least been motivated by it. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the ELCA's commitment to its own educational institutions, and then on Saturday there will be a brief appendix. Until then, God bless.